It began with a myth. A ghost story whispered by terrified pilots from the burning jungles of Java to the frozen shores of Alaska. A myth forged in the fire of a surprise attack and polished by a string of seemingly impossible victories. It was a myth of invincibility, and at the heart of that myth was a machine and the men who flew it. The Mitsubishi A6M0. To the Imperial Japanese Navy, it was the embodiment of the warrior's soul. To the battered and bewildered Allied pilots of 1942, it was a devil. It could outturn, outclimb, and outfly anything the Americans or British could throw at it. Its pilots, the aces of the Imperial Navy, were hailed as gods, their kill counts soaring into the stratosphere. They flaunted their zeros with a swagger that bordered on arrogance, and frankly, they had earned it. But every Goliath, sooner or later, meets his David. And in the vast, unforgiving theater of the Pacific War, David didn't arrive with a sling. He arrived with 2 roaring Allison V12 engines, a blistering top speed of over 400 miles per hour, and a pair of deadly .50 caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon staring right back from the nose. He arrived in the form of the Lockheed P-38 Lightning. This is the story of one of the most dramatic reversals of fortune in the history of aerial combat. The story of how American ingenuity, sheer guts, and a radical, misunderstood fighter plane shattered the myth of Japanese invincibility and taught the aces of the rising sun a brutal, final lesson about the cost of underestimating the American spirit. To understand the revolution, you first have to understand the terror. And in the dark, early days of 1942, terror had a name: the Zero. Picture yourself for a moment. You're a young American pilot, maybe a farm boy from Iowa or a college kid from California. You trained on sturdy, forgiving aircraft. You were taught classic, by-the-book dogfighting tactics: get on your enemy's tail, outturn him, and get a clean shot. It was a gentleman's duel, in theory. Then you're thrown into the meat grinder of the South Pacific. The heat is suffocating, the humidity clings to you like a wet blanket. You're flying a P-40 Warhawk. It's a solid, rugged bird. A workhorse. But it's heavy. You look up and you see them. They look different. Fragile, almost. Their wings are so long, so elegant. They don't fly in rigid formations. They move like a swarm of hornets, fluid and unpredictable. The fight begins. You push your throttle forward, feeling the familiar vibration of your Allison engine. You try to get into position, but the Zero, it doesn't follow the rules. You turn into him, and he turns inside you. It's like trying to outmaneuver a dragonfly. His turning radius is impossibly tight. You're hauling back on the stick with all your strength, your vision graying out from the G-forces, and this Zero is just hanging there, glued to your 6 o'clock. You look in your mirror and you see the flashes from his wing. Not just machine guns, but 20mm cannons. Cannon shells that rip through your airframe like it's tissue paper. Your buddies, the guys you drank with last night, are spiraling down in flames, their parachutes nowhere to be seen. The radio is a cacophony of panic and static. This wasn't a duel. It was a slaughter. And the men flying those Zeros, they knew it. They were the samurai of the sky. Pilots like Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, who they called the Devil of Rabaul. Or Saburo Sakai, a farmer's son who would become a living legend. These men had been fighting since 1937 in China. They were veterans, their skills honed to a razor's edge. They viewed their aircraft as an extension of their own bodies. They possessed what the Japanese called shibumi, effortless perfection. Saburo Sakai himself wrote in his diary about the early American pilots, and his words drip with a kind of pitying contempt. He said they flew, and I'm paraphrasing here, like clumsy beginners. They would try to turn with him, and he would simply slide inside their turn and kill them. It was that simple. The American press, desperate for any good news, started calling their own planes, like the P-39 Airacobra, flying coffins. Morale was in the toilet. The myth of the Zero wasn't just propaganda, it was a psychological weapon, and it was winning the war before the battles even began. The Allies were facing an existential question. How do you defeat an enemy you can't catch and can't outfight? The answer, it turned out, was lying in a smoldering heap in the Aleutian Islands. A stroke of luck so monumental, It would change the entire course of the air war in the Pacific. Because to kill a ghost, you first have to tear it apart, piece by piece, and learn its secrets. And in the summer of 1942, the Americans got their hands on the ghost itself. June 4, 1942. A date that lives in infamy for another reason. The Battle of Midway was raging. But on a remote, fog-shrouded island called Outran, off the coast of Alaska, a different, quieter drama was unfolding. A Japanese pilot, Flight Petty Officer Tadayoshi Koga, was flying his Zero on a mission to attack the Dutch harbor naval base. His plane was hit by American anti-aircraft fire. It wasn't a killing blow, but it severed his oil line. Koga was a skilled pilot. He saw a flat, grassy field on Outran Island, a perfect place for a forced landing. What he didn't know was that the grassy field was a vast, waterlogged muskeg bog. He came in low, gear up, for a textbook belly landing. But the moment his plane touched down, its lightweight frame sank into the mud. The aircraft flipped violently onto its back, crushing the canopy. Tadayoshi Koga was killed instantly. For over a month, his Zero sat there, inverted, hidden in the fog and rain. The Japanese knew he was down, but they assumed the plane was destroyed. The Americans, they had no idea it was there. Then, on July 10th, a U.S. Navy PBY Catalina, on a routine patrol, spotted the wreck. The pilot, a sharp-eyed young man named William "Bill" Thies, recognized the distinctive silhouette immediately. This wasn't just any wreck. This was a Zero, and it was almost intact. The intelligence coup of the century. This was the equivalent of finding the Holy Grail, if the Holy Grail could kill you. A salvage team was rushed to the site. They worked for days in the freezing, miserable conditions, carefully extracting the plane from the mud. They had to patch the fuselage, pump out the water, and somehow get this priceless artifact back to a place where it could be studied. They succeeded. The Outran Zero, as it became known, was crated up and shipped to the North Island Naval Air Station in San Diego, California. And there, in a locked hangar, a team of America's best aviation engineers and test pilots began the autopsy. What they discovered was a revelation. It was like peeling back the layers of a magical artifact and finding the compromises. The Zero's incredible performance came from a philosophy of extreme minimalism. It was built to be light. Incredibly, dangerously light. Its engine, the Najima Sakai, was powerful for its weight, but it was a radial engine without the self-sealing fuel tanks that were becoming standard on American planes. One good incendiary round in the fuel tank and the whole thing would go up like a torch. It had no armor. No armor plate behind the pilot. No bulletproof glass. The pilot was a sitting duck. The control cables ran outside the cockpit, completely exposed. The Japanese designers had sacrificed everything: protection, survivability, structural integrity, for one thing: maneuverability. The American engineers were stunned. It was brilliant, and it was insane. This plane was a thoroughbred racehorse, fast and agile, but with the fragility of fine china. It could win a duel, but it couldn't survive a brawl. And most importantly, they discovered its weaknesses. At high speeds, the ailerons, the control surfaces that make the plane roll, stiffened up dramatically. The Zero became a slug. It couldn't roll. It couldn't dive. If you pushed a Zero into a high-speed dive, the wings were known to just rip off. The test pilots took to the skies in a repaired, flyable Outran Zero. They dueled with it, simulated combat. They learned its every trick, its every blind spot. They developed a new set of rules, a new playbook. It was simple: boom and zoom. Never, ever turn with a Zero. That's what he wants you to do. Instead, use your superior speed and power. Dive on him from a higher altitude. Make the boom. Fire a devastating burst from your heavy machine guns and cannon. Then keep going. Use your speed to climb back up to altitude, the zoom. Reset. Do it again. It was the tactical equivalent of a boxer refusing to trade punches with a faster opponent, and instead using his superior reach and power to land one knockout blow at a time. The playbook was written. Now, they just needed a plane that could execute it. And waiting in the wings was the very machine that could do it. But the P-38 Lightning had its own troubled story. When it first arrived in the Pacific, many of the veteran pilots, traumatized by the Zero, wanted nothing to do with it. It was big. It was complicated. It was weird. They called it the fork-tailed devil, but at first, they said it with a sneer, not with respect. They were about to learn that this strange, twin-engine monster was the only thing in the sky that could turn the hunter into the hunted. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning was born from a radical idea. In 1937, the U.S. Army Air Corps put out a request for a new, high-altitude interceptor. They wanted a plane that could climb to 20,000 feet in under 6 minutes and hit speeds of over 360 miles per hour. Ambitious doesn't even begin to cover it. The genius designer behind it was a man named Kelly Johnson at the Lockheed Skunk Works. Johnson looked at the conventional single-engine designs and threw the rulebook out the window. His design was a twin-boomed monstrosity. It had 2 engines, 2 superchargers, a central nacelle for the pilot and a devastating nose armament of 4.50 caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon. All that firepower concentrated in the nose, no propeller to sync with, no converging bullet patterns. You pointed the entire plane at the enemy, and when you fired, it was like throwing a freight train at him. On the ground, it was a beast. It was over 37 feet long, with a wingspan of 52 feet. It was heavy. It was complex. And to the pilots used to the straightforward P-40, it was intimidating as hell. You had to manage 2 engines. You had a critical engine-out procedure that could kill you if you got it wrong. And then there was the compressibility problem. Early in its career, test pilots discovered a terrifying quirk. In a steep, high-speed dive, as the Lightning approached transonic speeds, the air flowing over the wings would become supersonic. This would create a shock wave that would blanket the tail elevator, making it useless. The plane's nose would tuck down further, and the dive would become uncontrollably steeper. The pilot would pull back on the stick with all his might, but nothing would happen. The plane would just keep accelerating, shaking itself to pieces, on a one-way trip to a crater in the ground. Several pilots died figuring this out. It was the Lightning's original sin. But the engineers, again led by the relentless Kelly Johnson, found a fix. They added small, dive recovery flaps under the wings. When the pilot got into a compressibility dive, he would flip a switch, these flaps would extend, and they would change the airflow, lifting the tail and pulling the plane out of its death dive. It was an ingenious solution to a problem no other plane flew fast enough to even encounter. Now, imagine you're a combat commander in the Pacific in late 1942. You're getting these new, complicated P-38s. Your pilots are scared of the Zero, and now you're giving them a plane with a known, fatal diving flaw? A plane that required a PhD in engineering just to start the engines? The initial reception was chilly. The first P-38 squadrons deployed to the Pacific suffered growing pains. There were mechanical issues. Pilots, still thinking in terms of turning fights, tried to dogfight Zeros and got chewed up. The Japanese aces, the first time they saw the twin-boomed silhouette, were curious. They called it 2 planes, 1 pilot. And after those first, clumsy encounters, they weren't impressed. They thought it was another clumsy American brute, easy prey for their nimble Zeros. They couldn't have been more wrong. They were judging a fish by its ability to climb a tree. The Americans just hadn't learned how to swim yet. The learning curve was steep, and it was paid for in blood. But a new generation of pilots was arriving. Young, aggressive men who hadn't been traumatized by the early defeats. Men who were willing to learn the Lightning's unique language. And they were about to be led by one of the most brilliant and controversial fighter commanders the United States would ever produce. His name was Lieutenant Colonel Thomas J. Lynch. And alongside a quiet, deadly pilot named Richard Bong, he was about to take the P-38's raw, flawed power and forge it into the most lethal weapon in the South Pacific. But to do it, they would have to face the devil of Rabaul himself, in the skies over one of the most hellish battlegrounds of the entire war. A place they called the Slot. The intelligence was in. The target was rich. The stage was set. But in the steamy, malaria-ridden heat of Guadalcanal's Fighter II airstrip, the new wonder weapon, the P-38 Lightning, was still a question mark. It was big, it was complicated, and its pilots were about to be thrown into the fire against the most experienced, deadly aces in the world. This was the moment of truth. Would the Lightning be a breakthrough, or just a very expensive, very complicated failure? Let's take you to Henderson Field, Guadalcanal, late 1942. The air smells of mud, aviation fuel, and decay. The Marines on the ground are holding on by their fingernails. They're bombarded every night by Japanese warships in what they call the Tokyo Express. And every day, waves of Mitsubishi Betty bombers, protected by those dreaded Zeros, scream overhead to pound their positions. The Cactus Air Force, the ragtag group of Marine, Navy, and Army Air Force pilots defending the island, is flying everything that can get airborne. Grumman Wildcats, those tough, tubby little Navy fighters, are holding the line, but they're outclassed by the Zeros. They're desperate for an edge. And then, the 339th Fighter Squadron arrives with their new P-38s. The first impressions weren't great. The ground crews looked at this twin-engine beast with suspicion. Where a Wildcat had one engine to maintain, the P-38 had two. It had two superchargers, two sets of turbo intercoolers, a complex hydraulic system. It was a mechanic's nightmare. The veteran pilots looked at it with equal parts curiosity and dread. Captain Thomas Lynch, a 24-year-old from Catasauqua, Pennsylvania, was one of the first to really get it. He wasn't a loudmouth or a glory hound. He was a thinker, a tactician. He'd pored over the technical reports from the Akutan Zero analysis. He understood the boom and zoom doctrine in his bones. He'd gather his young pilots, kids like Dick Bong, a quiet, unassuming farm boy from Wisconsin who looked like he'd be more at home milking a cow than flying a cutting-edge fighter. Lynch would draw diagrams in the mud. "Listen up," he'd say, his voice calm but firm. "Forget everything you think you know about a dogfight. You see a Zero, your first instinct is gonna be to turn with him. Don't. You do that, and you're dead. He will be inside your turn before you can even blink." He'd point to the sky. "We own the vertical. We own the sun. We use our climb rate to get above them. We use our dive speed to hit them like a hammer. One pass. One killing burst from the nose. Then you don't look back, you don't try to watch him fall. You firewall the throttles and you climb. You climb like the devil himself is on your tail. You get back your altitude advantage. Then, and only then, do you come back for another pass." It sounded simple. In practice, it was terrifyingly difficult. The first few encounters were messy. A young pilot, seeing a Zero float in front of his guns, would get target fixation. He'd fire, and then, instead of breaking off, he'd try to follow the falling enemy, or worse, try to turn with his wingman. And in that moment of hesitation, a second Zero, the unseen wingman, would pounce from above. The Japanese aces quickly identified the new American fighter. At first, they were cautious. But after a few skirmishes where the P-38s tried to play the Zeros game, their confidence returned. Saburo Sakai, in his later writings, recalled an early fight with a P-38. He said the American pilot made the fatal mistake of trying to turn with him. Sakai simply kicked his rudder, stood his Zero on its wing, and sliced inside the Lightning's turn, his cannon shells shredding the big American plane. To him, it was just another kill. The P-38 was earning a grim reputation, but for all the wrong reasons. The problem wasn't the plane. It was the playbook. And the playbook was about to be rewritten in blood and fire over the waters of the Solomon Islands. Two men emerged as the masters of the Lightning. They were a study in contrasts, a duo that perfectly represented the two sides of American combat prowess. First, there was the mentor, the tactician, Lieutenant Colonel Thomas G. Tommy Lynch. By early 1943, Lynch was a squadron commander, a veteran of the tough early days. He wasn't the top ace, that would come later, but he was the brain. He was the one who refined the tactics, who taught the new kids how to stay alive. He was calm, methodical, precise. His kills were works of surgical execution. Reset. He was the professor. And then there was the phenom, the natural, Major Richard I, Dick Bong. Bong was different. He was shy, almost awkward on the ground. He had a boyish grin that made him look even younger than he was. But in the cockpit, he was a predator. He didn't just follow the boom and zoom doctrine. He perfected it, adding an almost supernatural sense of timing and deflection shooting, the art of leading a target so your bullets and his flight path intersect. Bong's method was deceptively simple and terrifyingly aggressive. He would get above the enemy, sometimes so high his contrails would paint a target in the sky for everyone to see. Then he'd pick his target, not necessarily the lead plane, but often a straggler, someone on the edge of the formation. He'd roll inverted and then he'd dive. Not a gentle descent. A full throttle, stick forward, compressibility be damned dive. The lightning would scream down, the airspeed needle quivering deep into the red line. He'd wait until the last possible second, until the enemy plane filled his entire windscreen. He'd fire a split-second burst from his 4.50 calories and single 20mm cannon. It wasn't a spray of bullets, it was a focused lance of lead and high-explosive shells. The effect was catastrophic. For a zero hit with that much concentrated firepower at point-blank range, the result was often instant disintegration. Wings would fold back, fuel tanks would detonate, the plane would simply come apart in a ball of fire. Bong would then pull back with all his strength, fighting the G-forces, engaging those dive flaps if he had to, and claw his way back to the safety of altitude. He never hung around to confirm the kill. He trusted his gunnery. His wingman's job was to watch his back and call out the kill. This cold, efficient methodology racked up victories at an astonishing rate. But the plane itself was evolving to meet the pilots halfway. The engineers back in the States were listening to combat reports. The early P-38F models were good, but they needed more punch. So they added more power with the P-38G and H models. They fixed the troublesome turbo superchargers. They gave them better radios. And they addressed the one remaining flaw in the boom and zoom tactic, the initial attack. Diving from 30,000 feet gave you speed, but it also made you a predictable, streaking target for a sharp-eyed Zero pilot who could snap roll out of the way. The solution? Surprise! The P-38s began flying higher and using their excellent turbo superchargers, which kept the engines powerful in the thin, cold air where the Zeros struggled. They would stalk the Japanese formations from above and behind, hidden by the glaring sun. They perfected the thatched roof attack, a near-vertical dive onto the unsuspecting enemy. The Japanese pilots, conditioned by years of fighting slower, less powerful aircraft, had developed certain habits. They would often fly in loose, flexible formations, confident in their ability to individually outmaneuver any threat. They rarely looked straight up. Their cockpit canopies offered poor rearward visibility. They were vulnerable from the one direction they never expected an attack, the zenith. The stage was now set. The weapon was honed. The killers were trained. And in April 1943, they got a target worthy of their new skills. A target so valuable, his death could change the course of the entire Solomon Islands campaign. U.S. naval intelligence, through the top-secret magic of code breaking, had deciphered a Japanese naval message. It was the travel itinerary for Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, the most brilliant and revered strategist in the Imperial Japanese Navy. He was flying on an inspection tour. His path would take him right over the Solomon Islands, right into the killing zone. The order came down from the highest level: get Yamamoto. April 18, 1943, Palm Sunday. The mission was dubbed Operation Vengeance. It was unprecedented, a targeted, long-range aerial assassination of a specific enemy commander. The man tasked with leading the kill was Major John W. Mitchell, one of the most respected P-38 pilots in the theater. He knew the mission was a long shot, a staggering feat of navigation and timing. They would have to fly over 400 miles over open ocean at wave-top level to avoid Japanese radar and intercept Yamamoto's flight at a precise point in time and space. A mistake of a few minutes or a few miles, and the entire mission would be a waste. Mitchell handpicked 17 of his best Lightning pilots from the 339th Fighter Squadron. Among them were the two men who would be the killer flight, Captain Thomas Landfair and Lieutenant Rex Barber. The intelligence was perfect. They knew Yamamoto was a stickler for punctuality. He would be in a Betty bomber, escorted by 6 of the finest Zero pilots from the 204th Naval Air Group. They would be arriving over Bougainville at 9:45. Before dawn, the 18 P-38s, each carrying extra belly fuel tanks to make the long journey, lifted off from Henderson Field. They dropped to 50 feet above the water, the salt spray from the ocean waves speckling their canopies. For 2 hours, it was a nerve-wracking game of silence and navigation. No radio chatter, just the roar of their twin engines and the endless, empty blue of the Pacific. Right on schedule, at 9:34, Mitchell's navigators spotted the coastline of Bougainville. And then, a miracle of planning, a dot in the sky. Then 2. Then a formation. It was them. Exactly on time. Mitchell's voice crackled over the radio, calm and cool. Tally-ho. Bandits. 10 o'clock high. The game was on. Mitchell led the top cover flight of P-38s to climb and engage the escorting Zeros, which were already diving to intercept. He had to keep them busy. That's when Lanfear and Barber, the killer flight, broke away. They spotted the 2 Betty bombers, already descending, heading for the airfield at Kahili. They pushed their throttles forward, jettisoning their now empty external tanks for better performance. They were going for the kill. What happened next is one of the most debated moments in aerial combat history, a controversy that continues to this day. The official version for decades was that Captain Thomas Lanfear climbed, engaged and shot down one Zero that tried to head him off, and then dove to shoot down the lead Betty bomber, which carried Admiral Yamamoto. But Lieutenant Rex Barber told a different story. He said he went straight for the 2 Bettys. He lined up on the first one and opened fire. He saw his rounds rip into the bomber's wing and fuselage. It began to spew smoke and flame. He then switched to the second Betty and raked it with gunfire as well before being forced to break off by attacking Zeros. The truth is likely a combination. It was a frantic, violent, close-range melee. The Zeros, piloted by elite aces, were fighting like demons to protect their admiral. P-38s and Zeros were twisting and diving through the tropical sky, tracers crisscrossing, engines screaming. But the outcome was undeniable. The lead Betty, hit by devastating fire, most likely from Rex Barber's guns, plunged into the jungle of Bougainville. The second, damaged Betty crash-landed in the sea. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto was dead, killed in the crash. The architect of Pearl Harbor had been executed in the air, 1,000 miles from his own safe bases. The P-38s, low on fuel and ammunition, broke off the fight and raced for home. They had done it. They had proven, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the Lightning was a strategic weapon capable of reaching out and touching the enemy anywhere at any time. The impact was seismic. For the Japanese, it was a catastrophic blow to morale. The invincible admiral had been slain. The myth of their security was shattered. For the Americans, it was a moment of supreme triumph, a cathartic payback for the day of infamy. And for the P-38 Lightning, it was its coming-out party. No one would ever call it a flying coffin. It was now truly the fork-tailed devil. The death of Yamamoto was the exclamation point on a sentence the P-38 pilots had been writing for months. The myth of the Zero was broken. But the war was far from over. The Japanese aces, humiliated and enraged, were about to throw everything they had left into one final, desperate struggle for the skies. And waiting for them, with more lightnings, more aces, and a newfound, unshakable confidence, were men like Bong and Lynch. The era of American dominance had begun, and it was moving at 400 miles per hour. The jungle was a slick, steaming green hell. And in the pre-dawn blackness of a forward airstrip, a young crew chief wiped oil from a propeller hub, his touch almost reverent. He looked up at the twin-tailed silhouette of his pilot's P-38, a beast they'd nicknamed Marge after a sweetheart back home. He didn't know it, but in a few hours, that same plane, piloted by the quiet farm boy from Wisconsin, would be screaming down out of the sun to tear the heart out of a Japanese formation. The lessons had been learned. The tactics were perfected. Now, it was time for the aces to write their legend in fire across the South Pacific. With the Yamamoto mission, the P-38 had proven its strategic worth. But for the men of the 5th Air Force, under the hard-driving command of General George Kenney, the Lightning was about to become something more, a scalpel. Kenney was a visionary. He saw the P-38 not just as a fighter, but as a long-range escort, a ground attack platform, and most importantly, an ace maker. And the factory for these aces was the 5th Air Force's 49th Fighter Group, and specifically, the 9th Fighter Squadron, which became home to the most lethal collection of pilots the Pacific would ever see. The professor, Tommy Lynch, was now a master craftsman. He had a knack for taking raw, talented pilots and turning them into killers. His lessons were gospel. Check your 6, boys. Your life depends on the guy behind you. Conserve your ammunition. A 3-second burst is a waste. A 1-second burst is a kill. And for the love of God, if you see a 0, think up, not around. And his star pupil, Dick Bong, was proving to be a once-in-a-generation talent. But Bong wasn't a braggart. After a mission, he'd land, his marge often dotted with holes or stained with oil from a nearby explosion. He'd climb out of the cockpit, give that shy, crooked smile, and matter-of-factly report to the intelligence officer. I got 1. A 0. He just came apart. He didn't revel in the kill. He treated it like a job he was terrifyingly good at. But Bong and Lynch weren't the only stars in this new constellation. There was Gerald Johnson, a charismatic and aggressive pilot from Ohio. They called him Jerry. Where Bong was quiet, Johnson was all fire and passion, a born leader who could inspire his men with a wink and a confident grin. He lived by the Lightning's creed, speed is life. And then there was Thomas McGuire. If Bong was the serene master and Johnson the inspiring leader, McGuire was the obsessed artist. Intense, competitive, and fiercely driven, McGuire studied aerial combat with the focus of a scientist. He kept detailed notebooks, analyzing every engagement, every shot, every mistake. He was determined to surpass Bong's score, and that burning ambition made him one of the most aggressive, and sometimes reckless, pilots in the theater. This was the Ace Factory, a brotherhood forged in the crucible of combat, bound by a common language of throttle settings, deflection shots, and the unique, twin-engine roar of their aircraft. They developed their own rituals. Bong had his marge. Johnson had his lucky scarf. They'd play poker in the sweltering heat of their quonset hut, the air thick with mosquitoes and the smell of sweat and aviation fuel, the conversation a mix of hometown stories and shop talk about boost pressures and cannon jams. They were kids, most of them, but in the air, they were old men, their eyes constantly scanning, their minds calculating angles and trajectories. They were hunting the hunters. And the Japanese aces, the veterans who had once ruled the skies, were starting to feel the tide turn. The swagger was gone, replaced by a grim caution. They now looked up, searching the high altitudes for the distinctive twin-boomed silhouette they had once mocked. The playground for this deadly game was the sky over Rabaul. This massive Japanese fortress, with its 5 airfields and thousands of anti-aircraft guns, was the Hornet's nest. And in late 1943, General Kenney decided it was time to kick it. The result was one of the most intense, sustained air campaigns of the entire war. A battle that would push the P-38 and its pilots to their absolute limits. Rabaul was a fortress carved into a volcanic caldera. To attack it was to fly into the mouth of the dragon. The air was thick with black, oily smudges of explosions that filled the sky with shrapnel. And waiting above were the Zeros, now flown by the most desperate and determined Japanese pilots, the last line of defense. The American strategy was brutal and simple, attrit them to death. Day after day, the P-38s would escort B-24 Liberators and B-25 Mitchells over the target. The missions were long, grueling affairs. 4, 5, 6 hours in the cockpit. The tension was a physical thing, a knot in your stomach that tightened the closer you got to the harbor. You'd see it from miles out, the dark, brooding shape of the volcanoes, and then the puffs of flak, first sporadic, then a solid wall of black smoke. The bomber pilots called it going into the blender. The P-38 pilot's job was to fly through that hell and keep the Zeros off the bombers. This is where the boom and zoom doctrine became a refined art form. The P-38s would weave high above the bomber stream, a protective umbrella of speed and firepower. Then the Zeros would come. They'd dive from above, trying to pick off straggling bombers. Bandits. 5 o'clock high. The radio would crackle to life. A flight of lightnings would peel off. Not down into a turning fight, but up, climbing at an angle the Zeros could only dream of. They'd gain an altitude advantage, then roll over and dive, their noses pointed like accusing fingers. This is where Dick Bong's genius became pure poetry. He had an uncanny ability to judge a deflection shot, to fire not where the Zero was, but where it would be a split second later. He'd lead his target, his tracers arcing across the sky, and then the Zero would fly right into the stream of bullets. It looked like magic. On one mission over Rabaul, Bong's flight was jumped by a dozen Zeros. Instead of running, he led them up. He knew their weakness. The Lightnings, with their powerful superchargers, climbed into the thin, cold air where the Zeros' engines gasped and lost power. The Japanese pilots, their planes becoming sluggish, watched in frustration as the P-38 circled above them, masters of the high ground. Then, one by one, the Lightnings would pick their moments and dive. It was a turkey shoot, but it wasn't one-sided. The Japanese were still deadly. Their pilots, facing the destruction of their base, fought with a terrifying, sometimes suicidal, ferocity. They developed new tactics of their own, trying to lure the P-38s into low-speed fights. They would fake damage, trailing smoke, hoping an overeager American would slow down to finish them off, only to be pounced on by a hidden wingman. The toll was relentless. Pilots you had breakfast with would fail to return for dinner. The ground crews would watch the skies, counting the returning planes, their hearts sinking with every missing silhouette. Tommy Lynch, the mentor, the professor, was killed in April 1944 during a low-level strafing run. A burst of ground fire hit his P-38, and he crashed into a jungle hillside. The news devastated the squadron, especially Bong, who had lost his friend and teacher. It was a stark reminder that in this grinder, no one was invincible. The cost of air superiority was paid in blood every single day. By the end of 1944, Rabaul was neutralized. The skies belonged to the fork-tailed devil. Dick Bong's score soared past 30, then 35, eclipsing the great Eddie Rickenbacker's World War I record. The quiet farm boy was now a national hero, his picture in all the papers. But back in the Pacific, the war was changing. A new, even more powerful American fighter was arriving, the P-51 Mustang. And a final, epic confrontation was brewing over the Philippines. A battle that would pit the veteran Lightning aces against a desperate enemy in a fight for the very future of Japan. With Rabaul broken, the war moved north. The liberation of the Philippines began, and with it, the P-38s found a new, vast battlefield. But the environment had changed. The new Japanese fighters were arriving, like the Negima Ki-84 Frank, a plane that finally had the speed and power to challenge the Lightning on more even terms. And the Japanese pilots, while less experienced, were often more fanatical, willing to become kamikazes. The P-38, in response, evolved again. It became a hunter of hunters. Its long range made it perfect for prowling the shipping lanes, cutting off Japanese reinforcements. Its concentrated firepower was devastating against transport planes, bombers, and even small ships. This was the era of the free hunt. Instead of being tied to bomber escort, flights of P-38s would roam deep behind enemy lines, looking for trouble. And they found it. Dick Bong, now a major and largely free to hunt as he pleased, continued his incredible streak. His methods became even more refined. He was a ghost. He'd appear where he was least expected, high above a Japanese airfield, waiting for someone to take off. He understood the psychology of his enemy. He knew the pressure they were under, the dwindling supplies, the low morale. He used it against them. But the competition within the Ace Factory was reaching a fever pitch. Thomas Maguire, his score climbing into the high 20s, was obsessed with catching Bong. He took greater and greater risks, pushing his P-38 to the very edge of its performance envelope. He perfected a demanding, high-G maneuver called the Maguire turn, designed to reverse direction rapidly in a dogfight. It was a brilliant tactic, but it bled off energy, the lightning's lifeblood. It was a move born of impatience, of a burning need to score, and it was a gamble against the laws of physics. Meanwhile, Bang's legend grew to almost mythical proportions. There was the time he flew so low over a Japanese airfield that his prop wash blew the officer's laundry off the clotheslines. Another time, he returned to base with several feet of a tree branch stuck in his wing. He'd been so low during a strafing run that he'd clipped the jungle canopy. His luck, his skill, seemed supernatural. In December 1944, General Kenny, following orders from General MacArthur himself, sent Dick Bang home. His war was over. With 40 confirmed victories, he was America's ace of aces. He was given a hero's welcome, awarded the Medal of Honor, and sent on a war bonds tour. He had survived the grind, the world's most dangerous job, and he had triumphed. But back in the Philippines, the war went on without its king. And for Thomas Maguire, the pressure to now be the top ace, to finally claim the crown for himself, became all-consuming. The stage was set for one last, tragic act in the drama of the fork-tailed devil. On January 7, 1945, over the island of Negros, Thomas Maguire and his wingmen spotted a lone Japanese Zero below them. It should have been a textbook boom and zoom. But in his desperate drive for one more kill, Maguire broke his own rules. He committed the once and the P-38 was never meant to commit. And in that moment, the hunter who had mastered the lightning for so long forgot what had made him great. The price for that mistake would be the ultimate one. The air over Negros was thick and heavy, a suffocating blanket of heat and tension. Below, a lone Japanese Zero, an enigma P-43, weaved lazily, a tempting, oblivious target. For Major Thomas Maguire, with 38 kills to his name, it was the siren's call. He was so close. Just 2 away from tying Bang. Just 3 from surpassing him. The crown was almost within his grasp. He stood on the wing of his P-38, Pudgy V, running a hand over the sun-baked metal. His wingman, a young lieutenant named Edwin Smitty Smith, watched him, seeing the intense, almost feverish focus in his eyes. "Smitty, we get this one and the next, we're right there." Maguire's voice was tight, a wire stretched to its breaking point. Hours later, at 25,000 feet, they found him. The lone Oscar. It was too easy. A trap? Maguire didn't care. He radioed Smitty, "I'll take him. You cover." The playbook was clear. Dive from altitude. A single, slashing pass. Climb away. But as Maguire rolled in, the Oscar pilot, a wily veteran, saw him coming. He didn't panic. Turned. A tight, hard turn into Maguire's dive. A cooler head would have aborted. Would have rocketed past, using that incredible speed to climb back up and reset. But Maguire's ambition overruled his training. He wanted this kill. He needed it. He pulled back on the stick, trying to tighten his turn to get a shot. He was trying to outturn a plane that lived and died by its turn radius. Smitty, Smith watched in horror from above. "Tom, break it off. You're too slow. You're losing airspeed." Maguire's P-38, bled of its energy, began to shudder, on the verge of a stall. The lightweight Oscar was holding the turn easily. Maguire, in a final, desperate act, slammed his flaps down, trying to tighten his turn even further, a brutal, high-risk maneuver he himself had pioneered. For a second, it worked. His nose swung toward the Oscar. But it was a ghost of a chance. The P-38, overstressed and slow, shuddered violently. The left wing stalled completely. The world outside Maguire's canopy became a violent, uncontrollable spin. Pudgy V snapped into an inverted stall and began to corkscrew toward the jungle below. "Smitty," Smith screamed into his radio. "Tom, Maguire, pull out." There was no answer. The P-38, America's fork-tailed devil, carrying one of its greatest and most driven aces, spiraled down, 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 until it vanished into the thick, green, unforgiving canopy of the Philippine jungle. There was no explosion, just a final, sickening silence. Thomas Maguire, the obsessed artist, had been killed by the very thing he sought to master, his quest for the crown ending in a remote, anonymous grave. The news of McGuire's death sent a shockwave through the Pacific. It was a brutal, sobering lesson. The P-38 was a weapon of precision and speed, not a brawler. It demanded discipline above all else. McGuire's tragedy was a final, stark reminder of the Zero's enduring, deadly trick, the lure of the turning fight. It was the last great loss of the Lightning's era. For Dick Bong, back in the States, the news was a profound personal blow. He was touring factories, a living legend, but the death of his friend and rival hollowed out the triumph. He had won the contest, but the cost felt immeasurable. He'd later confide to a friend that he felt no joy in it, only the weight of those who hadn't made it home. The war ground on. The P-38, now joined by the incredible P-51 Mustang, continued to dominate the skies. But the era of the great individual aces was drawing to a close. The war became one of massive formations, strategic bombing, and overwhelming industrial might. The personal duels that defined the early years were fading into history. In August 1945, the atomic bombs fell. The war was over. The screaming dive of the Zero and the deep-throated roar of the Lightning were replaced by an eerie, unfamiliar peace. So what became of the men and the machine? The Lockheed P-38 Lightning, the fork-tailed devil, was phased out of service almost immediately after the war. Its complex, twin-engine design was too expensive for a peacetime air force. Many were scrapped, melted down into ingots, their legacy seemingly destined to be forgotten. But the plane had done its job. It had broken the back of Japanese air power at its zenith. It had proven that American engineering and tactical innovation could not only catch up but could utterly surpass an enemy that had once seemed invincible. Richard Bong tried to settle into a quiet life. He married his sweetheart, Marge, the namesake of his plane. He became a test pilot for Lockheed, flying the new, jet-age P-80 Shooting Star. It was a fitting transition from the pinnacle of propeller-driven flight to the dawn of the jet age. But on August 6, 1946, exactly 1 year after the bombing of Hiroshima, Bong's P-80 malfunctioned on takeoff. He ejected, but was too low for his parachute to open. America's ace of aces was killed, not in the brutal chaos of combat, but in the sterile, tragic silence of a California airfield. The nation mourned a hero lost just as a new, uncertain world was beginning. The Japanese aces who survived, men like Saburo Sakai, returned to a shattered nation. Sakai, who had once viewed American pilots with contempt, came to hold a deep respect for his opponents, particularly the P-38 pilots who had finally bested him. He would later write that the war had been a tragic folly, a lesson in the futility of believing in one's own invincibility. The myth of the Zero was not just broken, it was replaced by a hard-won understanding of the cost of hubris. The story of the P-38 Lightning and the Japanese Zero is more than a tale of machines and kill counts. It is a timeless human drama. It's a story of initial shock and awe, of terror and desperation. It's about the power of intelligence, of learning your enemy's weaknesses and having the courage to adapt. It's about the men like Tommy Lynch, the teachers who build others up, like Dick Bong, the quiet, natural masters, and like Thomas McGuire, the driven souls consumed by their own fire. The Zero was a masterpiece of minimalism, a samurai's sword. The P-38 was a masterpiece of complexity, a scholar warrior's scalpel. The samurai believed in the purity of the duel, the single, perfect stroke. The scholar warrior believed in leverage, in using his opponent's strength against him. In the end, the scalpel prevailed. The lesson echoes far beyond the clouded skies of the South Pacific. It's a lesson for any of us who have ever faced a seemingly invincible challenge, a zero, in our own lives. The answer is rarely to meet that challenge on its own terms, to try and outturn it in a fight it designed. The answer is to find your own altitude, to use your unique strengths, your speed, your innovation, your resilience, to boom and zoom, to hit hard, reset, and live to fight another day. The roar of the Lightning is silent now. The men who flew them are gone, but the legacy they forged in fire and courage remains. A legacy that screams through history. No myth of invincibility can ever long withstand the determined, ingenious spirit of the free.